I'm back from North Carolina, where, if you've been following my community posts, you'll know that I lost my glasses. So I'm recording this video with my backup glasses, partially because I want to know what you guys think. Do you like these glasses? Drop a comment below and let me know. Also, while you're at it, like this video. Thing is, whether you say you like them or not, I will still have to buy something extra because first of all, these are an out-of-date prescription, and second of all, the lenses on my old glasses had something on them called an anti-glare coating. And although I'd noticed glares even when I had that coating, with these glasses that have no coating, the glare from certain angles can be borderline ridiculous, so I apologize if you notice any obvious errant glares throughout this video. So either I need to buy new lenses or I need to buy new lenses and a new frame, which wouldn't be a massive additional cost. So be honest, if you like these frames genuinely, then tell me, but if you think there is a different style of glasses that would actually complement my face way better, then this is your one chance to have some input, so don't squander it. Anyway, speaking of very important things, let's talk about my gratifyingly popular video where I debunk trans identity. I think I've mentioned before that I put off making this video for a long time because I was worried it wouldn't do very well, and if I just released it and hardly anyone watched it, that would have been a massive waste of what I thought was one of my best argued videos. But just this one time, the algorithm came through for me, and you guys helped massively with that, and that video is now my second most popular video of all time, and I always like it when a video that I really want to do well does well. And of course, that maximized the possibility of getting some responses, even though I didn't actually get that many. In fact, I only got two, both live stream responses, one of which was from this reasonably popular channel called Papa Gut, which sounds like it could be really entertaining, right? I mean, watching a trans activist fall apart upon exposure to facts and logic as their entire worldview crumbles around them. The problem is, neither of the people who made responses to me actually cared about the trans issue that much. On the contrary, one of the recurring criticisms of Papa Gut's video is that a lot of what he was saying was just, who cares? This doesn't matter. Why are you talking about this? So in some sense, this is a win for me, right? The only people who were brave enough to actually make responses to my video are those who don't have very much invested in this debate in the first place, suggesting that people who would actually have something to lose if trans identity was shown to be complete nonsense are completely unwilling to actually engage with my video, almost as if they know deep down that my video would prove their beliefs to be complete nonsense. But it does kind of make the stakes lower for me responding right now, especially compounded by the fact that these were live reactions, so the standards are kind of lower in that this isn't a scripted response that these people made. And unfortunately, all of this means I don't actually have that much to sink my teeth into here. This isn't going to be as comprehensive as my original video. Papa Gut just has a few key points that are the bedrock of his position, and that's all I'm going to be engaging with here. But since he's not some hardcore trans activist, a lot of what he was saying didn't really intersect with what I was saying, as you'll see. And on a note, he didn't seem to understand my position either, indicating at several points that he thought I might have been a conservative.
Like, this is the thing. People who adhere to like old school stereotypes about what a man and a woman should be are the type of people who will say you are less of a man if you don't adhere to this and more of a woman, or less of a woman if you don't adhere to this.
Obviously, the nature of this being a live reaction means it will be harder for me to pick out neat snippets of him saying certain things that make it absolutely clear what he's saying, so I might have to provide some context. Here, he's saying this as if it's some sort of response to me, which of course it isn't, because I don't support the enforcement of traditional gender roles on anyone. The fact that he's confused here means that for the majority of the time he spent responding, he didn't actually understand the position from which I was coming.
Does this video like accidentally become woke?
Also, coincidentally, he says this, which happens to be the topic of my most recent video on this channel.
Where like there could be a very low level of gender dysphoria technically if like you wish you had bigger tits, I suppose. Or as like a guy, if you have low testosterone wanting higher testosterone, maybe you have a level of some kind of gender dysphoria because you want more testosterone, you want more gender affirming care. You just want it to affirm the your born sex rather than your I guess the opposite one.
For people who aren't denying reality, they don't need testosterone to affirm their born sex. The fact it's the sex they're born with, which is the only sex anyone has, means that no intervention is necessary to affirm it. So getting into the substance of the video, like I say, a lot of it is just him complaining that what I'm talking about doesn't matter. Now, here are 4 comments that just happen to have been grouped together by the YouTube algorithm when I sorted by top comments. And And as you can see, 3 of them are calling Papagut out for his entire response basically amounting to, this doesn't matter. Now, I'm not going to show every single time that he just says, this doesn't matter, and why do you care, and why is this relevant, but there's one point where he tries to make this argument, and it's very funny to me.
And in like a society where we accept like religion, which takes a lot of faith and takes a lot of faith and a lot of alternative reality belief to engage in. I think that if we can accept those types of realities or those types of ideologies, we can accept like a trans person feeling like they were born in the wrong body.
So there is so much that I could say in response to this statement, and the first thing I want to point out is that this is literally the analogy that gender criticals make. Helen Joyce has literally said that pretty much her singular solution to the trans identity debate problem is that it should be treated like a religion. People can believe it if that's what they want to do, but they shouldn't force other people to participate. Maybe we can make some accommodations for these people's belief system, but only if it doesn't infringe on other people's rights and it doesn't require other people to accept these religious views as true. If we did accept trans identity as being like a religion, which is what Papagut seems to be suggesting here, then we would have to get rid of the Gender Recognition Act to be consistent, because we don't have a Reincarnation Recognition Act, we don't have a Trinity Recognition Act, we don't have a Shahada Recognition Act. And for this reason, most trans activists would actually get offended if you compared their beliefs to a religion, not least of all because most of them are atheists. And also, they know that even acknowledging trans ideology as a belief system would already be conceding too much ground, because then they would actually have to have arguments for it. Instead, they like to insist that trans ideology, or rather trans identity, is just a fundamental facet of reality and as such requires no arguments. It's just a fact that people are born trans men or trans women, and you can't deny it. And I guess this leads us on to the whole why does this matter question. Well, Papagut kind of answers his own question here. If trans identity is like a religion, then the fact that government policy is being rewritten to accommodate this religion is obviously going to matter to people who think that religion is wrong. The fact that there is a social expectation that I affirm trans pronouns and I'm a bigot if I don't matters if I don't want to affirm that which would require me to believe something I've not been convinced of. For Jews, it's very important that a baby is circumcised on the 8th day. But I believe that you shouldn't be doing anything to an infant's genitals when they can't consent to that unless it is medically necessary. And likewise, there are some trans activists who, based on their pseudo-religious beliefs, think that it would be appropriate to do something to a child's genitals before they are emotionally mature enough to know what they're doing. If we're being consistent here, we would say that both these things should be illegal because your religious beliefs don't override basic morality when it comes to the importance of emotional maturity as it relates to consent. And also, even if this didn't matter socially, there's still some value in talking about whether things are true or false. I mean, people talk about mathematical truth absent anyone denying those truths, so clearly divulging knowledge doesn't have to be in response to opposition. But even when there is an opposing side to evolution or heliocentrism or anthropogenic climate change, someone doesn't have to think it matters in order to make a point of stressing that those who disagree with this position are wrong. If trans identity is like a religion, well, not everyone who makes a point of explaining why they don't believe a particular religion is an anti-theist. There are atheists who talk about being atheists without necessarily thinking that religion is harmful. Sure, if you dedicate a whole channel to talking about a debate, that suggests some strong degree of investment, but honestly, maybe you just think the other side is entertainingly stupid. But I don't even have to labor this point because Papagut literally says this.
But like, that's not a diss on religion. That's like, me saying that, if that shakes your shit, that's your fucking problem. It's your faith. And if your faith gets struck by me pointing out that there's no facts to back it up, that's on you.
So in the video where he says that trans identity is like a religion, he then says that religious people shouldn't get mad about him pointing out that facts don't back up their religious beliefs. Alright, I guess I can just do my victory lap then. I mean, what else do I even need to say to add to that? Yes, I agree, Papagut. I agree with exactly what you just said. Trans ideology is like a religion, so if someone doesn't like me pointing out that it's incorrect, that's on them. But of course, I guess the question there is, do the facts disagree with trans identity?
The fundamental concept of sex and gender is that sex is the sex of the body and gender is the sex of the mind to some degree. That's pretty much all it is. It's philosophical. We're people that are able to engage in complex thought. We can have complex belief systems. And one of those belief systems is that some people might have been born a man or a woman or in the wrong body or something to that effect. You know?
Yeah, it's a philosophical disagreement where some people think that it's possible for a man to be a woman. So you'd agree then, if it doesn't really make sense to say a biological male can be a woman, then it makes complete sense that I would explain to people why the facts don't back up this religious belief. Good. That's why it matters. One of the limitations of my video comprehensively debunking trans identity is that it was supposed to be comprehensively debunking trans identity, meaning it was supposed to be taking every possible pro-trans argument and every worldview that could justify affirming trans identity and explaining why they're all wrong. The problem is sometimes it was addressing pro-trans positions that would contradict other pro-trans positions, meaning that very few people, save for a level of cognitive dissonance that is not unheard of in trans ideology, would be thinking that every single argument applies to them. As such, a lot of Papagut's live response is just him saying that he doesn't think most of the points I'm making are relevant because they're not relevant to his specific justification for trans identity.
What
Sure.
does it mean for a definition to be correct?
I really don't see how this is necessarily relevant so far to trans people, because so far his own language debunks him. Because again, his whole thing right now is, I mean, he started with the way people look. But again, if you have trans people that are expressing a certain way and they look like women, what's your argument then, right?
So here, for example, he doesn't think it's relevant for me to explain why there are certain correct ways of understanding the meaning of words. And he thinks that I'm debunking myself here because from his perspective, what I'm saying is, it's important that we understand words as having meanings. They describe what people look like. The thing is though, if you know your KC law, then you'll know that the very first debate I had around the trans issue was with Vorsch. And Vorsch's central argument was, there is no truth to language, it's something we just made up, and therefore we should just define words in whatever way makes people the most happy. You'll see what Papagut's defense for trans identity is in a moment, but suffice it to say his defense is very different from that. Which is why he was a bit confused when I started off the video by trying to make it very clear that words mean things and it matters that words have strict definitions. The point I was making is that if we can all agree that it makes sense to resist calling a pencil a sandwich because a pencil clearly is not a sandwich, then likewise, it makes sense in principle to resist a biological male being called a woman. Even if a biological male says that it would hurt his feelings to not be considered a woman, well, his feelings don't contradict the important reality that words have meanings. So hopefully this answers Papagut's question as to why I spent so much time in my video trying to stress that words have meanings, because once we understand that, we can't just change them arbitrarily to accommodate anybody's hurt feelings. And this is also why he's confused about me appealing to the way people look in order to make it obvious why we understand words as having meanings. That was just an obvious example. If something is clearly, just from looking at it, not a thing, it makes no sense to call it that thing. However, it doesn't necessarily follow that therefore, if something does look like that thing, therefore it must actually be that thing. Now, I will give Papagut some credit here, in that he does actually correctly anticipate one of the arguments I made that I thought some people might find kind of confusing.
So are we making the argument that we changed Pluto from being classified as a planet because it no longer fit the classification of a planet? And now the argument is that since let's say trans women, for instance, require extra steps in the way that Pluto would require an extra step to be a planet, they were calling it an exceptional planet. You're saying that we shouldn't classify trans people as women or trans women as women because it's too different. I think that's the argument he's making.
So yeah, I think that is worth giving some kudos. He does understand the thrust of the argument I'm making. So what I'm saying here is that one of the reasons why strict definitions matter is because if we become too inclusive with our definitions, then words will become less meaningful. Because the more inclusive we get with definitions, the more exceptions we have to make in order to clarify what we're actually talking about, and as such, the harder it becomes to describe and analyze the world. Like, to appeal to the other scientific example I gave, the word dinosaur did actually become less useful once we decided that birds would be included under the category of dinosaur. Because now, if you're a stickler for accuracy like me, you will never say that dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago. You will say non-avian dinosaurs went extinct. Because we typically talk about non-avian dinosaurs and birds in very different contexts, we'll often be talking about one and not the other. But because the term dinosaur now includes both groups, it means we will quite frequently have to add in a whole extra 4 syllables to clarify we're talking about non-avian dinosaurs as opposed to birds. So that's an example of how when words change meanings, it does get slightly more difficult to communicate clearly and accurately. And in the case of Pluto, the point was that because it's not like the 8 planets in the solar system, but it is a lot like the other dwarf planets, it wouldn't really make sense to treat it as one of 9 planets. Because then we'd constantly be having to make exceptions every time we spoke about the 9 planets in order to make it clear that this actually isn't true of Pluto, which is different. So yeah, that's my point, and Papaga accurately predicted where I was going with this, so well done him. As annoying as it is to keep having to specify non-avian dinosaurs, and as annoying as it would be to keep having to say the planets apart from Pluto, it would be so much more annoying and confusing to have to, whenever talking about the history of women's experience, of their oppression, of their liberation, to constantly have to clarify that you are not talking about the women who are in fact biological males that identify as women. Now the thing is, despite Papaga anticipating the argument I was making, he doesn't actually respond to it. All he does is acknowledge what the argument is and then move on.
I think that's the argument he's making. He seems to be setting the stage for multiple different claims, and then he's going to, I imagine, try to justify those different claims in a collective.
So he doesn't respond until a while later when I start giving some specific examples. For example, I point out that much of women's history has been defined by the economic roles they were doing, which were largely determined by the limitations and capabilities of their biological sex.
Has been in economic roles extending from biology. One of the
Sure. But then as time goes on, we're seeing that like those economic roles are becoming less necessary, right? As time goes on, there's less and less of a difference between men and women, specifically in what they're able to do, because we have technology that's able to kind of shore up the gap in those things, right? Our worldview has shifted more towards like people that are able to do a thing should have the opportunity to do a thing. We've shifted drastically in that sense. Right. And like now it's not necessarily about men or women. Like generally, men and women are going to be better at certain things. But like at the end of the day, we don't really operate based on that anymore. We operate like, hey, can you perform a task?
Now that is true, but the thing is, history matters. If we want to understand the current reality of a group, we have to understand the history of where they came from. The obvious analogy here would be to race, because that's always a great analogy. You cannot understand what it means to be black in America without understanding what that meant 100 and indeed even 200 years ago. Now, that doesn't mean we have to make policies and act differently based on this history. If that's your attitude, that's fine. If you just want to talk about right now when it comes to making policies for right now, I can understand that. I don't know if I'd entirely agree. I think arguments could be made against that, but it would be an interesting argument because both sides would have valid points. But if someone was to say that we don't need to talk about history at all when discussing certain groups and identifying members of those groups, well, then I think we've got a bit of a problem. I've made an analogy relevant to this before in a very old video that I'm probably going to remake at some point because that current video is very old and needs some revamping. But basically the analogy is to imagine that you go to a slave plantation in the deep south where one of the appeals, the unique selling points of this plantation is that the owners of it were black. And then you get there and it turns out actually the owners weren't black, they were white. Well, regardless of how much we can rethink the black experience in light of recent developments, it would obviously be wildly inappropriate to retroactively redefine what it means to be black such that we are fundamentally changing the racial dynamics of the slave trade. And that's my point. It would likewise be wildly inappropriate to redefine woman in a way that would retroactively change the sex-based and gender dynamics of women's oppression historically. Even if we can't say that women are oppressed in the exact same way today, that was still an oppression of women, uniquely so, when it happened, and that was based on biological sex. Yes, we could have the term woman include those biological females who have been significantly defined by their biological sex-based experience and biological males who feel like women, but before you're going to argue that's something we should do, you would have to present a compelling positive argument for why that makes sense. All we really get from Papa Gut is what we just saw there, the argument that women's lives are less determined by biological sex now because labour isn't as manual as it once was. But if we still need to talk about that in terms of understanding women's experience in the world, which does need to be defined in light of history, we would still need to recognise that woman is a biological sex category. We might say that women experience economic labour differently now since sex has become less relevant to a woman's typical day-to-day experience. However, that sentence, while seemingly perfectly analytically valid to most people, would in fact become completely meaningless if we say that woman is no longer defined by sex, because, well then, of course, sex has become less relevant to women's experiences, because sex has nothing to do with being a woman. What would otherwise be an observation about the change in the necessity of biological physicality and labour, instead is reduced to a mere tautology. And by the way, even Papa Gut uses language that makes more sense if man and woman are biological categories.
As time goes on, there's less and less of a difference between men and women, specifically in what they're able to do, because we have technology that's able to kind of shore up the gap in those things, right?
That statement there is assuming that technology has reduced the gap between men and women physically, which only makes sense if the distinction between men and women is a physical one. I don't want to deny any group a connection to their past, and that's why I'm very resistant to redefining words in a way that would retroactively change what it meant to be a member of a certain group in the past, unless there's a really good reason to do that. Now, for the most part, Papa Gut seems to prefer a material reality-based conception of trans identity, but he does briefly try to defend the more postmodern conception of it.
Even if you think it's wrong or crazy or whatever, you have to meet the argument. So the argument is like there are people who legitimately think that they're men or women, that they were born in the wrong body. That's like their legitimate like claim. And you're not meeting the argument. You're like, what if a dude pretended to be a girl right now? Well, that's never been the argument, right? So
I suspect this could be because my video is debunking so many other points of view, some of which he might not believe. He just tried to apply what I was saying to his own position, even though it wasn't really a response to his position. So again, the point is, I am meeting the argument, it's just not your argument. There are people who believe that a woman is just someone who identifies as a woman, and by the way, even if you accept Papa Gut's reframing of this as genuinely identifying as a woman,
anybody who genuinely identifies as a woman, right? Different argument. It's not the same thing. You can't just say anybody who identifies as something because they could be faking it. So like then your question could be like, oh, well, how do I figure out if they're like legitimately identifying? I'm just gonna die here. That's a great question, you know?
Yeah, that still has the circularity issue. The question is, what are they genuinely identifying as? In order to genuinely identify something, that thing must have a clear definition for you to be genuinely appealing to. But if that definition is just your appeal to it itself, that's circular. And Papa Gut seems to agree that you can't actually know what it is like to be someone else, because the only way they'd know how that feels is to know how other women feel and accurately identify that they feel that way too.
You never know how another woman feels. You never know how another person feels. This argument just like it doesn't make sense just from your day to day. You will never understand me and my complex experience in the way that I interpret the world at all. I could see green as blue. You have no fucking idea.
So when a biological male claims to identify as a woman, what they're really saying is, I feel like what I think it would feel like to feel like a woman. And that is not a robust foundation for changing the entire way that we use the English language. I mean, this whole circular definition thing is done to death. I think I already explained it in enough detail in my original debunking, so I'm not going to go over it here, but suffice it to say, adding the word genuinely doesn't actually solve any of the problems. The only way this could make sense is if when someone says they're identifying as a woman, they're referring to something external to the label of woman itself, rather to the physical thing that the label woman is identifying. And this is where we get to the central point of contention between myself and Papa Gut. This is ultimately what the video is really about. See, he thinks that it's perfectly legitimate to identify being a woman by stereotypes. And you can see this implicitly when he says that all of my arguments would fall apart if I was confronted by a biological male who looks like a woman.
Well, the difference is quite simple. See, the expression of these...
I understand the point here, but then like if I showed you a very passable trans woman on screen, all of a sudden your, hey, this is the reality of this person, but this isn't the reality of this person, argument goes away.
And this is also where he emphasizes the importance of expression over identity.
Do you think these statements are equally true for both these men?
No, but then there's like self-identity and then self-expression, right? So trans people typically express themselves to society in a certain way. Their dysphoria has to do with their internal identity parsed with the external reality of the world.
Now, one issue of this is that if you're saying that looking like something is as good as being that thing, then the entire concept of looking like something becomes incoherent. It would no longer make sense to say a woman looks like a woman because that would be tautological. By definition, if she looks like a woman, she's a woman. It would no longer make sense to say a man looks like a woman because that would be oxymoronic. Yes, there might be a typical idea of what a woman would look like that an actual woman might not look like, while a man might look more like that. But saying that that causes that man to become a woman, that's a very different discussion. I was looking at this black woman recently, the famous rapper Ruby Rose. And she is black, I think, otherwise she wouldn't be allowed to say the N-word.
I like dog niggas with a long rap shit.
But the thing is she even a darker skin tone than me? The point is that there's enough ambiguity around the appearance of certain broad demographics that actually there's all sorts of different ways that somebody could look like a member of that group, regardless of whether they actually are one. And the problem is, the more specific you try to get with the idea that looking like a woman makes you one, the weirder it sounds.
So like somebody might say, hey, I'm religious, but if they're not expressing religious beliefs, then you're like, oh, that person is lying. You might be like, hey, I'm a girl, but then if you're not really expressing to society that you're a girl, like, oh, maybe you're probably lying. Like, what does it really mean to you? Like, what does it mean to you that you're trans if you don't actually, like, make a conscious effort to necessarily dress it or express yourself a certain way based on the way that the reality is? Because if you're like, oh, I'm a woman, but you make no effort to make any changes to your external, people aren't going to look at you and be like, oh, there's something valid going on. There's no proof or evidence of your identification, right?
I've actually considered before making a video relating trans identity to people identifying as religions they're clearly not members of, mostly again to reinforce this very important point that words do need to mean things. Like, it was going to be mostly based on this conversation I had ages ago with this girl who claimed to be a Catholic, but then later on she said that she believed in polyamorous free love and considered marriage to be slavery. And I was like, alright, that's fine, that's what you believe, but for the record, that's not being Catholic. At least certainly being open about it isn't. But the thing is, I don't think that video would work very well because being religious is very different from being a woman. Like, religions tend to have specific creeds that they can point to that empower you to say, hey, if you don't believe this, then you are not a member of this religion. Like, for example, a Christian might say, if you can't affirm John 3:16, if you can't say you honestly believe that, you're not a Christian. And a Muslim could say, hey, if you don't believe that there is one God but God and Muhammad is his prophet, you are definitionally not a Muslim. There's no creed of womanhood. There's no possible purity test for womanhood. It's just a scientific description of your biology. In fact, it's kind of funny when trans activists will very much project and they'll act like the rad femme obsession with femaleness, especially the significance of menstruation, means they must belong to some sort of ritualistic blood cult. When in reality, it's just biological females are organized around facilitating the function of the large gamete in sexual reproduction. And part of how that manifests in most mammals is that they will shed their uterine lining. Yes, you can add spiritualistic dimensions to that, whether metaphorical or metaphysical, but that's not what makes you a woman.
Of some deeper reality that the categories of man and woman are defined by makeup, this is rather an objectionable instinct.
It's more than just makeup. It's using something using things in society to express yourself as more feminine. It's more than just like, hey, I like makeup.
See, trans activists are sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place, because obviously saying it is just about makeup would be incredibly reductive. But then saying it's something more complicated about how you interact with society in every facet of your being doesn't sound that much better. Firstly, it's confusing and as such doesn't really function as a definition at all because no one really knows what you're talking about. And secondly, by saying that there's this elaborate process of how you truly, genuinely interact with the world as a woman, you are inviting a huge amount of purity testing. The thing is that usually simpler definitions are better. The problem is, with trans identity, they don't want to provide a simple definition because that would end up sounding offensively reductive. But the solution there isn't to make the definition more complicated, rather it should be to anchor the definition of woman in something that wouldn't be offensive to refer to, which is to say anchor it in biology rather than femininity. So this leads us to the big question. Is it offensive to identify women by stereotypes? One of my central criticisms of trans ideology is that they say it's really offensive to misgender someone, but that would require that there exists a moral weight to being a man or woman. If I call a woman a man, then I'm supposedly offending her, as if being considered a man is some great insult for a woman. My argument is that actually what's best for achieving progress around our understandings of man and woman is if people recognize it's just a scientific description, and the worst case scenario if someone describes you incorrectly is that they're objectively wrong, not morally offensive.
You are arguing that there is some moral significance to being a man as opposed to a woman, or vice versa, and that is sexist.
Okay, you're overthinking. That's not what that means. You can do whatever you want, but it's more about just respecting somebody's identity. It's not about putting moral weight into being a man or moral weight into being a woman. It's about like respecting somebody else's moral weight that they put into being a man and being into being a woman.
So this doesn't actually function as a response because my criticism is of other people putting moral weight on the categories of man and woman. The point is that if you are doing that, you are feeding into this idea that there is some unique moral value to being a man and a unique moral value to being a woman. And this is the perfect foundation for the idea that women should always be homemakers and men should be strong, stoic providers. And eventually Papa Gut ends up saying this.
So for a trans man, being called a woman wouldn't be morally offensive because women are bad. It's because to them, they are not a woman. Like if you call somebody a slug, that would be considered bad. All right, we understand this.
So I get it, it's just an off-the-cuff example towards the end of a live stream, but it's still a funny example, right? We're not saying being called a woman is morally offensive, it's just like calling someone a slug. It seems to me like maybe this guy doesn't have a great grasp on what could be considered offensive, which inclines me to take some of his opinions on that issue with a grain of salt.
It's not sexist to identify that there are things that men and women tend to lean towards. It's sexist to force those people to engage in those things. That's the sexist part. Saying that women tend to be more empathetic and is not sexist. Saying that if you're a woman that's not empathetic, that you're a piece of dog shit, that's sexist. You don't have to hold people to it.
See, the issue here is that people aren't just observing that women tend to act a certain way. That is actually fine. The problem is these people are going on to argue that acting that way is what can make someone a woman. It's not really racist to observe that black people tend to like certain foods. Some people might be offended by that observation, but no, it's not racist. It would be racist, however, to say that a white person liking fried chicken makes them black. I mean, you could say it in like a joking way, like if there's a white guy who likes loads of really stereotypical black food, you could say, hey, that guy's the blackest white guy I know. And honestly, yeah, you could say that a man is the most womanly man you know. He is the man who acts the most like a typical woman from what we observe. But the thing is, trans activists aren't saying that. They're not joking. They are sincerely saying that they think it is a reasonable position to argue that adherence to female stereotypes is what makes someone a woman. And in some sense, that does almost circle back round to, yeah, you literally are forcing people to engage in the stereotypes, because you're saying, at least in the case of so-called trans women, that in order for their identity to be considered valid, they need to prove their identity is valid by participating in the stereotypes. You know, if trans people are going to argue that needing to get sterilized in order to have their identities accepted by the state is equivalent to eugenics, then it would logically follow that needing to participate in feminine stereotypes in order to have your identity accepted by someone like Papa Gut is equivalent to enforcing stereotypes. And for actual women whose identity is based on being biologically female, it would probably be quite offensive to them as women who have striven to define themselves in opposition to simplistic stereotypes, for somebody to then say that biological males can be as much women as they are precisely because they embrace and willfully perform those stereotypes, and that's what makes them women. It would also be probably quite offensive to a lot of women if one of your key metrics for determining who's a woman is this.
Here's how I like to ask, like, oh, man or woman or whatever. If you're a straight guy, who would you rather fuck? This person or this person?
As offensive as that is, it's worth noting he's not even consistent on this point.
Are there differences between trans women and cisgender women? Of course. Who does it matter to? Doctors. And doctors, when it comes to sports, and if I'm going to fuck you. Those are the only times that it really matters.
So on the one hand, one of the things that proves that trans-identified males are women is that you would have sex with them as a straight man, but on the other hand, whether you would have sex with them as a straight man is one of the few areas where them being biologically male actually matters. Look, I've actually already made an entire video on whether or not a straight man would ever actually have sex with a trans-identified male, and then considered whether this would give us reason to say that such a trans-identified male must be considered a woman. It's quite an exhaustive look into the topic, so I will just link it up here and I will leave it at that. Check it out, I would recommend it. It's kind of a entertaining, sort of humorous video that actually at the same time functions as a pretty in-depth exploration of the topic. I think taking things more broadly though, Papa Gut is arguing, well, in most contexts, it would make sense to understand somebody like Blair White as being a woman. It would feel normal and natural for someone to say of Blair White, oh yeah, her over there. And yeah, does it actually feel more accurate to point at someone who is clearly presenting in a very feminine way, who maybe looks pretty much indistinguishable from an actual woman, and say, oh, him over there? Probably not. Interestingly, this argument, which is actually Papa's core argument, is the one that he dismisses as having never actually heard of before. The first argument that might be given is what I'd call the accuracy defense, basically arguing that the reason we should include biological males under the category of woman is because it allows us to be more accurate.
I have never heard this ever. I don't know what the fuck you're talking about.
So the accuracy defense I was talking about here would be that it makes sense to refer to Blair White as a woman because to most people that lines up with their intuitions. That's what I was talking about here. And Papa Gut's response to my counter that, well, it doesn't matter how things look on the surface because there's still a reality deep down, is that, well, that deep down reality doesn't actually matter in most cases. Now, the first issue there is that the way we use language reverberates outwards. If you're going to say, well, I'm going to call this man a woman because he looks like a woman, you have now redefined woman. And redefining woman changes what it means to be a woman for all women in society, the same as if we redefined black. He says, well, the biological definition only really matters for scientists and doctors. And okay, let's say that's true. The issue is that people's understandings of science and medicine will falter if there is a massive disconnect in the way that language is being used. If we just kept calling Pluto a planet and not calling birds dinosaurs and saying that there are only 4 elements, earth, wind, air, and fire, and saying that biological males can be women, well then when scientists try to communicate to us the scientific reality using the language that only matters for them, we're not going to have any idea what they're talking about. I would say that unless there's a very good reason not to, we should try to bring the language that everyone uses as much in line with the language that scientists are using as possible. So if biological sex matters to scientists, it matters to all of us. And then the final point to consider is when Papa Gut dismisses me saying that the real solution here that would work best for everyone is to change the way that we as a society treat the categories of man and woman such that people feel less pressure to perform these traditional stereotypical gender roles. Most people who affirm trans identity probably would...
Like, that's nice, but that's not like the actual, that's just not going to work the way that you want to maybe pretend to work. I don't know if you should necessarily care. It's like, yeah, instead of doing this, we should just do this. Why aren't people doing that? Because it's not as effective. That's why.
Cool.
Like, affirming somebody's gender is much more effective right now than completely deconstructing the way that our society views, men and women.
Now, the thing is, I can understand someone saying, well, right now, we live in a gendered society, so there needs to be something to accommodate people who are affected by that. But the issue is when that very accommodation perpetuates the problem itself, which is definitely what's happening in the case of trans identity. Like, trans identity accommodates people who have this obsessive idea that they should have been born a woman rather than a man, but it also pretty obviously reinforces that type of thinking. Certainly, it's doing that when we actively teach children that they can be trans or non-binary. We have this idea pushed everywhere in mass media, and we have pride celebrations enforced on society through the power of the state. If we weren't doing all of that, I could accept trans identity as a temporary solution for those who currently have a very strong feeling of association with the opposite sex. Genuinely, I could. I don't want to be totally unrelenting in dismissing those feelings. It just bothers me when people say that these feelings change the actual meaning of those words and then try to impose that new meaning on others in society. Ultimately, this guy's starting position of, well, isn't trans identity really like religion, pretty much covers everything that needs to be said. If you don't believe in that religion, you shouldn't be forced to participate in it. Anyway, everyone, that's the end of the video, so I will address the elephant in the room. This is going up, 3 days later than it should have? The reason for that is that I was on holiday, as you heard, and the thing is, I got back, and I think this is a pretty normal thing, but basically, when you are out of the habit of doing something, it's very difficult to get back into starting to do it. So, I was trying to work on this video, but I had zero motivation to do it. I would write one paragraph and I'd be like, oh, I think I should have a break and stuff. And yeah, basically it's as simple as when I am in the habit of making these videos, which I usually am, then in order for me to not do that, that would require me to actively change towards not doing it. But when I've just been on holiday for 2 weeks, and also I had, so I wasn't scrambling to work on the videos before then, I actually, for a week before, or maybe even 2 weeks, wasn't really doing anything because I'd already got all the videos prepared in advance. And then I get back and I, even had another video planned for when I was back. Basically, I've gone a whole month without working on a video. So it was just really difficult to be oh, I'm going to do it, especially seeing as I was jet lag. So it wasn't I was getting up with my regular morning routine where I was up, go attack the day, do some exercise, clean my teeth, have a shower, get dressed. No, I've basically been very sluggish, but that is something, from starting now, I cranked out the video, of course. I did the thing where when I was actually cranking out the video, I was this is easy. It's one of those things where, once you actually get into the rhythm of being productive, you're why the hell did I just waste a whole week? What's the word? Not prevaricating. Oh, that's procrastinating. Yeah. Why'd I waste all that time when I could have had this done ages ago? But yeah, whatever. I imagine a lot of you guys don't really care about the schedule too much, even though, I am very strict about it. So you might expect it. But yeah, I wasn't getting any comments from anyone hey, where's the video? Well, here it is. Anyway, and hopefully this is going up on Saturday. I'm recording it on Saturday, but I'm imagining I'll be able to edit it reasonably quickly. There was also, by the way, a whole extra bonus thing. I wasn't expecting this video to be that long when I first planned it out, so I was going to do a little bonus section. I might, I don't know, make the bonus thing as kind of a comment or something. I'm not sure. Because it'll be fun to. You'll find out what it was. Anyway, sorry. I guess I'll just wrap up now. So do let me know about the glasses. Again, I'm imagining. So I can tell. So here, this is when I just get so much glare, you literally can't even see anything. The anti-glare. So there is an anti-glare coating that fixes that. Like I say, I need to get new prescription or update the prescription anyway. Even though this isn't that bad, I can't really tell. I just feel maybe it's not that good to be walking around with out of date prescription because it could cause eye strain and stuff on a kind of subconscious level. So yeah, I need to get that updated. In a way, it would almost be more convenient if you guys wanted me to get different glasses, because then I could just get new frames with basically I'd be able to order them. Whereas obviously, if I want to update the frames in these glasses, update the lenses in these glasses, I actually have to bring them in. So. But either way, either you save me money or you save me effort. There's no I don't want anyone saying oh no, those glasses are fine. If you like these glasses, say you like them. If you think there's better glasses, if you think my old glasses were better, let me know, because I want to look good Maybe that's why you guys come here, not for my arguments. Come on, are you kidding me? I don't style my hair and wear my fancy black top and definitely manage to have fantastic lighting that doesn't randomly cause the camera to get blurry because you guys are here for the arguments. Anyway, but by the way, so the other thing, Patreon, I do Patreon bonus videos. The last Patreon bonus video I did was absolutely terrible because I did it right in the midst of exactly what like is happening, like the slump that I was just talking about that led to this video being delayed. I like forced out a bonus Patreon video that wasn't very good at all. I wasn't very motivated to do it, and yeah, it wasn't great. And I'm sorry to my patrons for that. The good news is this video or this clip you're about to see now is from a different Patreon video. So I'll show you that.
And view that as some kind of over-the-top extra level of treatment. Like, trans people are still more statistically likely to face discrimination in the workplace, in housing, in court, in policing, in public spaces.
Well, again, it's worth noting, so I believe the fun statistic is that once you account for race, a lot of the issues for like being trans go out the window. And yeah, I think maybe it is true that specifically white, I mean, you know, it's kind of funny to me, like trans people are all about, or let's say your typical progressive trans activist is all about intersectional. You've got to be intersectional. But as soon as someone could point out that a white, middle class, male, trans identified person is going to have maybe some advantages, and certainly a lot more advantages than your typical trans person, suddenly I feel like these people get like offended, because obviously what they want to do is talk about how oppressed, and you usually have these white middle class males talking about how oppressed trans people are, but the oppression they're talking about is of trans people who aren't white, who come from poorer backgrounds. So actually they're not really appreciating the significance of intersectionality when they try to claim that oppression for themselves, even though based on all of the other things they have going for them, they probably have an advantage. If that looked good, then check it out. Give on Patreon, that's really appreciated. Just bear in mind my most recent video is probably not going to be that appealing. Anyway, sorry, I probably kept you here longer than I needed to, and I haven't actually got lunch yet, and I need to get lunch. I don't know if I'm going to get this edited in time because it's Saturday and I actually have something that I wanted to do this afternoon. Alright, bye!